Welcome to our Q4 event, State of Manufacturing. My name is Jake Ward. I'm the chair for TSMA. I'm excited today to have RSM, who is the 5th largest tax and audit consulting firm in the world. Is that right, guys? We're excited to have them here today to speak. It should be a great event here. Next slide. First, we want to thank our sponsors. Our event sponsor is Harding Szymanski. Our signature sponsor, Toyota, as well as our visionary supporters, Anchor, Berry Plastics, Cook, Jasper Engines, and Old National Bank. Purpose statement of TSMA: to work collaboratively to create a vibrant and attractive manufacturing environment in Southwest Indiana that results in improved revenue and profitability and increase manufacturing sector jobs. It's definitely a great organization to collaborate with other manufacturers to strengthen your own organization. I'd like to thank our steering committee for all that you do in helping put on these great events for everybody. If you're not involved in a peer group, I encourage you to. It's a smaller group. It's a lot of the folks that, attend these events that on a smaller scale to dial in a little more specific into your area of expertise. We have a lean peer group, and the next event is November 30th, and a CFO peer group, which is December 14th. And if you have anybody in your organization who's never been to one of our peer groups, I would encourage them. I always get great feedback from everyone in our organization that does attend. I know that they typically go back and enjoy them. So I'd encourage you to get involved in a peer group if you're not. Also, save the date for our Q1 event, Manufacturing Excellence, featuring Making Chips. It's a live podcast. It's going to be in Posey County at Nick's company. Like I said, it'll be a live event that will be recorded. Should be a good time. I think it's our first live event podcast, Making Chips. If you've not heard of them, look them up on, pick up your smartphone and open up your podcast, type in Making Chips. A lot of great content, and I'm excited to have them show up here in the local Evansville area for Q1. Also, in our Q1 event, we're going to be awarding our first Tri-State Manufacturing Alliance TSMA Excellence Award. So I would encourage you to nominate if you think your organization could, I think there's a lot of organizations that are on the call today and throughout members of TSMA that are very deserving. So I'd love to recognize you and recognize the great manufacturing organizations and the things that you're doing, right here in the tri-state. So I would encourage you to submit an award or submit an entry. So we'd love to recognize you. Next slide. All right. Like I said, excited about our speakers today. First up is Jason Alexander. And like I said, they're the 5th largest tax and audit consulting firm. Jason is an analyst in RSM industry, which positions it's an analyst to understand, predict, and communicate economic, business, and technology trends shaping the industries and sectors that he serves. And Bart Huthwaite, hopefully I said that right, Bart. He's a leader in RSM's operations and supply chain practice. Bart's focus on assisting clients addressing the challenges and opportunities across the value chain, including procurement, demand planning, integrated business planning, manufacturing, assembly, and distribution. Next slide. All right, it's all you, Jason.
All right, thanks, Jacob. I think we can probably get right to slide 4. I think Jacob did a good job in terms of introducing us and providing an overview of RSM. But just again, RSM, we're the 5th largest audit, tax, and consulting firm in the U.S. We have about $3 billion in revenue and over 10,000 employees. So very excited to be here today to share our perspectives on what's going on in the manufacturing industry and just the generally the U.S. economy in general with you. So I figured I'd start just with a little overview in terms of where our chief economist and our team see the economy going as we move into 2022. So as we look ahead to 2022 and really kind of towards a post-pandemic economy. Really there's 6 key components that our economic team has really kind of taken into consideration as they were coming up with their forecast here. The first, in regards to the pandemic, their assumptions are is that the end of the pandemic is really what they're including as their baseline forecast. As it relates to growth, they're expecting strong growth amid elevated inflation, which we'll talk about briefly here. Again, as we think about inflation, really they look to supply chain disruptions really to continue through mid-year next year. And when we look to the employment front, really their baseline forecast is calling for falling unemployment and rising incomes due to the increased cost of labor. On the policy front, really they're looking at the end of pandemic era rate policy and rising interest rates. And then, the impact that they expect in terms of, overall productivity. Really, we expect to see significant increases in capital expenditures, surrounding the infrastructure investment, which hopefully we and ultimately our group thinks are going to lead to rising productivity. And so, when we look at, our economists are calling for, a growth rate, this year, finishing the year around 5.5%, moving to, 4.2% in 2022, and, rounding out 2023, moving to 2.5%. Next slide, please. If we look at, their interest rate outlook, our economists are calling for, a steeper yield curve with the 10-year yield rising to 2.25% by the end of 22. With really, the risk there is, towards the upside with higher risks. Again, as I stated earlier, they're looking for the end of, pandemic era policies. The Fed prepares to, hike rates at the end of 2022. And as really, the Fed continues to taper their operations, which they announced in November, which are going to, begin in December. The expectation is that tapering is going to, be completed by, June of 2022. And so again, there's still strong financial conditions. And still, if you look at, the market overall, the lending market, there's still appears to be significant risk appetite. So again, we're expecting, steeper yields and higher rates as we, move towards the end of 2022. And in terms of, the inflation risk, and I'm sure this is probably, something that, all of our businesses are experiencing. Our team is expecting that, supply chain constraints will last into the, the second half of 2022, then ease, providing relief, hopefully to the inflation outlook. But, for now, the expectation is that, the inflation is going to continue to be concentrated, but mostly to, energy, transportation, and lodging. But we're starting to see some significant wage pressure, especially at the lower income end of the ladder. And again, there is concern that inflation, could be continuing to broaden, via the housing sector. Next slide, please. And, just to, touch again on, employment, our team is expecting that, the unemployment rate is going to decline to 3.5% by the end of 2022. But, they are expecting to see an acceleration in the baby boomers' retirement. And really, the expectation there is that that's going to lead to a continued tight labor market and result in, businesses and organizations continuing, accelerating the integration and adoption of technology to meet their increasing demand. Just to, kind of wrap things up in regards to policy, the American Rescue Plan Act, the 1.9 trillion and 908 billion, in fiscal aid is expected to be, signed into legislation. I think that there's still significant concern as it relates to, whether the Build Back Better program is going to be there. But our team, feels that if that legislation is ultimately passed, it will boost our overall growth and require, an upward revision to, to their baseline forecast. Next slide, please. I want to move next on to the RSM US Middle Market Business Index. So, our firm, in conjunction with the Harris Poll, has collected data on middle market firms, from a quarterly survey that began in the first quarter of 2015. And this survey panel, which is called the Middle Market Leadership Council, consists of 700 middle market executives and is designed to accurately reflect conditions in the middle market. The data is weighted to ensure that they correspond to the U.S. Census Bureau data on the basis of industry representation. And our survey, any reading above 100 for the MMBI indicates that the middle market is generally expanding, and then readings below 100 indicates that is generally contracting. And ultimately, the distance from 100 is indicative of the strength of the expansion or contraction. And so, according to our latest survey, American middle market business conditions point to continued robust economic growth, rising revenues and net earnings were reported during the third quarter survey, and was expected going forward over the next 6 months. The top line business conditions index increased from 133 in the second quarter to 145.5 in the third quarter of 2021, which was an all-time high for the MMBI survey during its history. However, we did note that the latest wave of U.S. COVID-19 cases, which were largely driven by the rise of the coronavirus Delta variant, it did denote a measure of risk, in the otherwise encouraging outlook. Both the third quarter MMBI data and responses to the forward-looking survey questions, it's really captured the economic boom underway in the middle market and the American economy, despite what we're seeing in terms of higher prices and the fact that companies are passing, a lot of times passing those costs on to consumers at this point in time. And so, what we're seeing in terms of the primary challenges for businesses, really, again, it continues to be the pricing environment, as both the global and the domestic, economies continue to struggle with, supply chain constraints and shortages of goods used at either, the intermediate stages or the final stages of production. So, 74%, of our survey respondents indicated that they paid higher prices for inputs, and 76% noted that they expect to do so over the next 6 months. And so in our estimation, the window to pass price increases downstream, may turn out to be, brief. Inside wholesale pricing and broader inflation aggregates, we can already observe moderation in the price increases. In so many cases, outright declines as supply chains slowly normalize. Next slide, please. So, on to, manufacturing. Obviously, manufacturing is an essential component of, U.S. gross domestic product, currently driving around, 12% of U.S. economic output. Manufactured goods comprise, over half of U.S. exports, and it's estimated that every dollar spent in manufacturing adds approximately $1.89 in business growth in other supporting sectors, including, retailing, transportation, and business services. So, obviously the role of manufacturing on the U.S. economy can't be ignored, which is, obviously a fact that I'm sure is not lost on this group here. And so when we look at the U.S. manufacturing sector, again, we continue to see expansion in October as growth remained positive, despite, again, the continued, supply chain constraints that we're seeing generally. The Purchase Managers Index, inched down to 60.8 in October from 61.1 in September, but still posted the 17th straight month of expansion since April of 2020, according to the most recent report, from the Institute of Supply Management. The report also showed that demand continued to be strong as the indices for overall new orders and new export orders stayed in expansion mode at 59.8 and 54.6 respectively. But the supply chain disruptions, again, were a drag as, growth on overall growth, as customers' inventories were at a low level while backlogs of orders were, significantly elevated, especially as it relates to the last couple of months. A couple of, notes that I think, highlighted what, respondents were saying to the survey. One, indicated that, the global pandemic related issues, worker absenteeism, short-term shutdowns due to part shortages, difficulties in filling open positions, and overseas supply chain problems, really continue to limit manufacturing growth potential. That was really, highlighted, by multiple respondents in the report. And there was also increasing risk from China as, some of the respondents pointed out how difficult it was to get their shipments out of the country because of the recent COVID-19 lockdowns in multiple cities, as well as a slowdown of just the Chinese, economy in general, which has experienced, a slowdown in activity in the recent months. And so, overall, as domestic demand outstrips supply, prices paid for input materials accelerated on the month. as the prices index rose to 85.7, 4.5 percentage point increase compared to the 81.2% in September. And so really, if we kind of think about the, the major takeaways from the last report, the big picture continued, I think, to center around, there's still solid demand, but there are still shortages of supply, which really kind of slowed down overall, potential growth. But I think it's important, to remain optimistic because the sector, will not stop its expansion anytime soon. Again, I think especially as we think that, the supply chain crunch, is hopefully gonna, ease, sometime next year. Next slide, please. Next I wanted to kind of move on to the RSM US Manufacturing Outlook Index, which is a composite of surveys conducted by regional Federal Reserve banks. And again, as because of the importance of manufacturing to the economy, really the health and the prospects of the manufacturing sector are really indicative of the potential economic activity for the US overall. And so again, our index noted that the recovery of the manufacturing sector in the United States remained intact in October, with expectations for the expansion to continue over the next 6 months. Surveys of the manufacturing activity conducted by regional Federal Reserve banks reported increases in new orders, again, despite backlogs, longer delivery times, rising prices, and inventories that, again, we noted were pretty low. Delivery times and difficulty in acquiring goods used at earlier stages of production, as well as intermediate goods, will most likely continue to dampen overall manufacturing sentiment, again, despite the the robust demand that we're seeing overall in the market. And so this given the continued growth that is expected in the manufacturing sector, we're advising our clients clients that they must continue to evaluate themselves and and how they are ultimately positioned for growth in the current environment that we now face ourselves in. I think that there's going to be a heightened focus on kind of supply chain resilience and visibility, as well as a continued automation across the entire value chain. And ultimately organizations that are investing in their technology to create a more connected ecosystem, really they're going to be best positioned to take advantage of any future potential shocks that we're going to see in the system. Next slide, please. Next I wanted to kind of talk about the infrastructure that supports the domestic and the global economies. Really, again, it's experienced a significant stress over the past few years. What we saw, we saw the twin policy shocks caused by the 2017 to 2020 trade war, and the decision to effectively shut down elements of the global economy during the pandemic. Really, it's resulted in an effective simulation of what deglobalization would potentially look like. And so, to capture this shift, our economics team created the RSM US Supply Chain Index, which provides a near real-time and forward look at the elements of transportation, manufacturing, sales and labor, and really that the items that underscore the manufacturing and services sectors. And so what we did is using a linear regression model, we found that our index is statistically correlated at a 99% confidence level with multiple major inflation indicators, the consumer price index, core CPI, personal consumption expenditures, and core PCE. And so, really what the result was is a confirmation that, our research is telling us that the supply chain disruptions are really largely behind the recent surge in inflation that we're seeing here in the United States. And so, if we look at our overall index, an index value of 0, is defined as a normal non-recessionary level of supply chain, efficiency. Positive values of the index suggest adequate levels of supply chain efficiency, and negative levels suggest deficiencies. And so, we expect to, really, update and capture the changing dynamics of the economy as it emerges from the pandemic using this index. Disruptions to the global and domestic supply chains, truly have resulted in reduced availability and choice for, both producers and consumers. And these disruptions are the primary catalyst for rising prices, not only in the United States, but again, we think across the world. And so, the bottlenecks are more than just, the ships waiting to be unloaded at the Southern California seaports. The shock to the system began with, like we said, the trade war in 2017, and then accelerated during the pandemic. And really, in our opinion, if anything, The pandemic just truly has exposed how, the aging condition of the U.S. supply chain, which we believe has been deteriorating for years, has profoundly hampered just, the U.S. economy in general and our ability to grow at a significant pace. Next slide, please. The next area I just wanted to kind of briefly touch on is just in regards to, the labor market. So, if we look at the last jobs report, demand for labor, really it showed little change, in September, which was the last, available, data, as, job openings stayed at 10.4 million, and the rate of people quitting their jobs reached an all-time high at 3%, according to, the latest data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And so, what we're seeing here is, the imbalance of the labor market, where the demand for labor continues to, outstrip supply. Really, it's causing, firms, and I'm sure probably a lot of your organizations are experiencing this, is, are being required to raise wages as they struggle to, attract and retain, workers. And, we're also seeing, the gap between the pool of unemployed workers, which we consider a proxy for the labor supply and job openings in September, remain significant at 2.8 million. And so, on the other hand, such a gap between demand and supply offered workers, an opportunity to, improve their careers as they switch to, better compensated jobs, which better match employers. But again, it pushed the quit rate to the record of 3.3% from 2.9% in August. And so, the gap seems hard to fill in the coming months, as the new hiring rate remained, stagnant at 4.4% on the month. The figure for August was also 4.4%. And so, we continue to see a battle for workers. And we're seeing that, the battle for workers, unfortunately, is continuing to, shift in the favor of big firms. And as the quits came from firms with, mostly 50 to 249 employees, these firms had 103,000 more quits in September compared to the previous month. So, again, our takeaway here is that, the labor market continues really ultimately to be a seller's market, that's benefiting workers. And we expect that, such a scenario is going to remain well into next year as demand for labor remains strong. And ultimately, while many constraints on labor supply will ease in the coming months as concerns over COVID-19 and childcare ease, there are reasons to, really expect that the workers will not come back as fast as originally thought, because of the persistent impacts from early retirees whose return to the labor force. Really, our team, places a, big question mark in terms of, the percentage of those workers that are ultimately going to, come back. Next slide, please. So, just to, kind of touch, follow up on the productivity and the labor, we had, 5, workforce transformation, items that, we thought are, of significant importance in what we're kind of looking at and focusing on in the coming year. One is just, again, the acceleration and retirement of the boomers. The second is the Delta variant and the pandemic. 3, ghosting. We're continuing to see, a significant amount of workers walking away, without, providing any notice to the employers as to what the situation is. Intergenerational wealth transfers. This is something that our team thinks is, not often talked about enough, but, really the impact of the 740,000, deaths caused by the pandemic, which has created, in some cases, a windfall among younger cohorts that is, putting them in different financial situations. And then there's the part of the culture now that has really adopted the YOLO, the you only live once, and really, the overall shock of the pandemic, really, it appears to have elicited a behavior change among some of the, the younger workers that are really taking time to reassess their lives and professional career, on a going forward basis. I can tell you that's something that, we're definitely seeing, that impact on our organization. Next slide, please. And so, given the current economic environment and the fact that, overall manufacturing sector, has really experienced, a decade of productivity stagnation and demand fragmentation, again, as well as the geopolitical tensions that we saw beginning with the trade wars in 2017, really, what does that, mean for the manufacturing sector going forward? we really believe that this is an inflection point for, for businesses where, organizations can take advantage of technology to really try to gain unprecedented transparency and visibility into their supply chains, to be able to predict, demand with the utmost precision, to work and use technology to improve product quality, to proactively, maintain equipment, increase throughput to levels that previously seemed unattainable, all the while, creating an enhanced customer experience, which, hopefully will, accelerate growth and lead to new and, innovative revenue streams, across the entire business. And so, over the following slides, I want to discuss the, the 7 key trends that, our research is telling us that, are most going to be impacting, middle market, manufacturers, over the coming years. Next slide, please. The first is in relation to, the importance of enhancing, IT infrastructure. And so, our research has told us that most middle market manufacturers really, their information technology infrastructure is really not ready to support, advanced industry 4.0 technologies. And so, IT professionals and, infrastructures ultimately are going to play, a significant role, in terms of allowing organizations to, implement the enabling technologies, to support their digital transformation efforts. And so, we are working with our clients and we're asking them, it's like, what are you doing to make sure that you're harnessing the vast amount of data available to you as an organization? What is the process, to improve production quality and to decrease risk to your operations? We think, a lot of these answers can be, answered by, supporting and enhancing your IT architecture. Next slide, please. The next item is, surrounding, data-driven decision-making. So, if we think about, what we, all of our organizations, we have, significant amount of machines, we have assembly lines, we have, hopefully smart sensors and robots and, and a significant amount of other devices, that collect and generate significant amounts of data. But I think, a lot of manufacturers and historically a significant amount of middle market manufacturers, really have not taken the advantage of this wealth of data that they had available to themselves. And as more and more companies, implement such, connected devices and connected technologies, it's going to be extremely important to have, a robust data strategy. It's going to be really, of paramount and more importance to organizations. And so, again, this is an area where, organizations need to take a step back and think about, do I have the right systems and processes in place to, make sure that I'm capturing the critical information from, my supply chain, from my production floor, from my distribution network. How do I translate this data into actionable information, that can help me, ultimately drive decision making? Again, we think that, being able to be a data-driven organization is going to be at the heart of being a more efficient and more effective, organization going forward. Next slide, please. As we think about, organizations that are continuing to, implement these advanced technologies, right, with the intent and hopefully with, design of using their data, more effectively. Many aspects of, traditional manufacturing operations and, and as organizations continue to, kind of break down those barriers, it also introduces, risk for cyber criminals to, really compromise a manufacturer's operations. And so, manufacturers and really, kind of any third parties that they're working with, really need to make sure that they're raising the bar in terms of, how they protect themselves in an environment where workers, machines, supply chains, and just, the organizations overall are becoming, much more connected. And so I'm sure everybody's seen in the news in terms of some of the things that have gone on recently in terms of the pipelines being compromised and organizations be subject to ransomware. And so, this is going to be an important thing for manufacturers to be asking themselves is, how do I protect my valuable assets from vulnerabilities? Making sure that, their intellectual property is controlled and free from potential vulnerabilities and attacks. So again, as organizations continue to become more digital and continue to, evolve along their digital transformation journey, cybersecurity is going to continue to be a significant component for them. Next slide, please. I think it's important, as we think about, data and the, the IT architecture, a lot of this is ultimately to be able to support organizations as they move to, the factory of the future. And so, for years, middle market manufacturers, I think, have again been really hesitant to invest in Industry 4.0 tools and technologies that really could help them reimagine their manufacturing operations. And so, now, especially, again, over the last couple of years, it's becoming more common for companies to embrace these cost-effective technologies and tools to really connect and analyze shop floor data and really to improve the quality and efficiency of their manufacturing processes. And so again, this is going to be an area where organizations need to be considering is do I have the ability to monitor shop floor operations to identify continuous improvement opportunities? Do I have the ability to safeguard operational technology from cyber attacks? What production what does production look like for my business as technology continues to impact all areas of the economy? So again, I think this is going to be an extremely important area for organizations to consider, and not just the impact on them, but the impact on their suppliers and vendors as well. Next slide, please. I'm going to briefly touch on this because my partner Bart is going to go into supply chains in a little bit more detail. But again, I think while manufacturers have historically have focused on making their supply chains more cost efficient, really, and I think the last couple of years again have showed us is that few had really considered how to address vulnerabilities to trade risks or global pandemics. And so again, this past year has shown that companies that had invested in technology and focused on supply chain agility truly have had an edge compared to their competition. And we think that that's going to continue to be true as we look to the future. And so again, I just want to briefly touch on this one because Bart's going to give us a little bit of a deep dive here as relates to supply chains going forward. Next slide, please. I talked earlier in terms of what we're seeing in the labor market, and I think that is very reflective also in terms of what we're seeing in terms of the shifting workforce dynamics. And so again, as manufacturers continue to grapple with the increasing role that technology is going to play throughout their organization, this is really going to play a significant impact on on their workforce. The dynamic and fast-paced environment that's created in today's advanced by today's advanced technologies, from intelligent robotics to big data and the industrial Internet of Things, really it's going to require a workforce to adapt. And so I have a lot of conversations with my clients in terms of now having to compete with technology companies and having to compete with the Amazons and the likes for talent, where in the past that it was not who they were competing with. And so again, we think that the shifting workforce dynamics is really should cause companies to kind of really take a step back and think about what are we doing to attract talent to our organization, and how is that going to allow us to sustain growth for the long term? How does my current workforce does my current workforce have the skills and tools to effectively drive the performance that we need to have as an organization into the future? And so I think that there's going to be, a lot of different ways that organizations are going to have to think about, engaging with their workforce going forward to make sure that, they're going to be able to meet the demand that, has been created in the market. Next slide, please. And the last, kind of, issue, and I think, again, I think that this is something that has become, extremely heightened, as a result of what we've seen over the last couple of years, is just the overall importance of environmental sustainability and governance issues on organizations, especially manufacturers. And so, more and more organizations really are treating sustainability really as an important objective in their strategy and operations, really to, and thinking about this as a mechanism and as a means to, increase growth and competitiveness for them as an organization. And so, when we think about, what's going on in terms of, the Environmental Protection Agency and, the introduction of, SEC frameworks and reporting requirements for SEC companies, it's only a matter of time before, somebody things works its way down, the food chain, and it's going to be, impacting, middle market organizations as well. And so, when we think about, what, consumers and investors are focusing on today, again, our research tells us that they're much more interested in, why a company does what it does and not just what it does. And organizations are really going to need to focus and think about, what commitment, they're making to their core values. Again, we're moving from the concern of only shareholders to more of a concern in terms of overall stakeholders, and stakeholders are requiring more transparency. Investor expectations again are continuing to grow, and you would need to kind of take a step back and ask yourself, does my organization have the data available to meet my ESG reporting requirements? So again, we think that this is going to be another area where organizations are going to have a continued focus, and should start preparing themselves for the requirements going forward. And so with that, we can move to the next slide, and I'm going to pass it to my partner Bart, to kind of give us a little bit more of a deep dive in terms of what we're seeing as it relates to supply chains. So Bart.
Thanks very much, Jason. Much appreciated. As Jason was indicating, the disruptions actually started prior to the pandemic with global trade up in the upper left. Of course, COVID came on fast and furious and led to significant lockdowns. And I bring that up because it really highlights the fact that we have not only a supply problem, as we've been talking about, but most certainly a demand problem as well in certain areas. And semiconductors, microchips are certainly one of those examples. As everybody went home to work from home or learn from home, the demand for consumer electronics and computers and peripherals went through the roof. So that really was a demand shock for the whole semiconductor industry. What was interesting about it was when it comes to autos, we've heard a lot of the automotive companies really struggling through this. It was a bit of a have and have not scenario in the early days, because Toyota, for instance, went through a big disruption back with the Fukushima tsunami. And so what they learned from that whole experience was the need to have mitigation strategies in place and understand where those risks in their supply chain were. So it really forced them to do a comprehensive review of their supply chain, identify those areas of potential risk, and then put mitigation strategies in place. I'm sure the person that was talking about doubling the inventory or tripling the inventory of microchips back then during those early discussions was not a popular person, but I'm sure his popularity increased tremendously over the past several months, as Toyota was much better positioned to address some of the shortages than some of the Detroit 3. That's just one example, but it highlights that we're not only dealing with a supply issue, but certainly a demand issue. Some of the other Detroit-based automotive companies, actually it was the tier one suppliers, shut down their production orders. So they actually got moved to the back of the line for the semiconductors, and it kind of exacerbated the situation. I was actually at an auto conference early last week and learned that GM doesn't purchase any semiconductors. They all flow through the supply chain. So when those tier one suppliers got a little nervous and shut down their orders, the Detroit 3 automotives got moved to the back of the line, and the chips went to consumer electronics and computer companies. But if Apple is struggling to get chips for their new iPhone, we all know that we have both not only a demand problem, but a supply problem. Obviously, that exacerbated. This is a picture of the fire at the Renesas plant in Taiwan, where a lot of semiconductors are made, and then the Texas weather and more hurricanes. So the fun doesn't stop, and the disruptions continue. So what's led to that? If we could go to the next slide, some of the outcomes for that. We've looked at a lot of economic data. This is a closer look at the producer price index, looking at all commodities, truckload and less than truckload. As you can see, shipping costs have been going up. But what I find interesting on the next slide, if we could go to that, is the fact that it's not universal. Yes, we're seeing some upticks, but it's really the transportation from Asia to the US. You can see these first two curves here, the blue representing Shanghai to LA, the green representing Shanghai to New York, and then this tealish representing Rotterdam to New York. So it's the inbound that is leading to the inflation in the shipping prices. As you can see, our outbound from LA to Shanghai or New York to Rotterdam isn't nearly as significant. So it's this, move from the US economy switching to purchasing goods rather than services and travel that has really exacerbated this demand problem. But of course, we have the supply problems, which we'll talk about as well. Next slide, please. As I promised, here's a chart focusing on the supply delays. As you can see, everybody is experiencing delays across all of the sectors, with manufacturing really being the leader here in terms of the pain that's being felt. So, this is certainly a challenge. It's not just the queues at the port in LA, for instance. It's the fact that the area that they have to store goods at the port is constrained. And so there's a challenge to get goods out of the port, off of the ships, into the port, and then out of the port into other trucks and onto other places. So it's not an easy problem to solve. It's not one that you can instantly throw people at, but they are making tremendous advancements. I like one story I heard not too long ago where there was a regulation in LA that on off-port lot properties, you couldn't stack containers more than 2 high. And so that was really constraining the amount of space they had. They were able to get that regulation changed within a day, which is pretty impressive when it comes to politics and change of regulations. So they were able to free up some space in those off lots where they could store some extra containers. But as we heard from Jason, there's a lot of closures happening in China today still. They had a cyclone a couple of weeks ago, which has created problems. So it's really this inbound from Asia and Europe into the US that's a big problem when it comes to shipping in containers. Next slide, please. Inventory, we all know that we built up huge amounts of inventory in the early days of COVID, but that inventory has been burning down precipitously since then. We're not seeing a lot of relief on that due to a lot of the reasons that Jason talked about, and the shipping constraints and the disruption. So we expect to see inventories continue to be a challenge. And really the focus, historically was all around trying to identify that slow moving and obsolescent inventory, try to free up some cash flow and reduce your inventory carrying costs. We're talking to more clients now than ever that are doing quite the opposite, really trying to segment their inventory, understand where those critical parts are, and then increasing inventories to the extent possible. It's really around trying to maintain those customer service levels, satisfying the customer requirements, given all of the inventory constraints that folks are facing today. Next slide, please. So what are some of our clients doing in other companies? I mentioned that obvious one, the stockpiling. That's happening to the extent that it can happen. That has a ton of unintended consequences, of course. Most of you will immediately think of the Bullwhip Effect, where you start getting pools of inventory across the entire value chain, and it's really starting to create a disconnect between supply and demand. So it's going to take some time to work through that, but that's what a lot of folks that we're working with are trying to the best of their ability to be able to do. And really that starts with, in the prudent section there, segmenting and optimizing the finished goods and raw materials inventory levels. It's difficult. Everybody's fighting fires on a daily basis. So what a lot of folks are doing, and we're encouraging them to do, is really focus their efforts on those critical parts and those critical inputs to your operations. Really going through and understanding that demand variability, the lead time variability, all of those various dimensions, and segmenting that inventory and coming up with unique strategies. Increasing the safety stock in certain areas may make all the sense in the world. So that's where we're seeing a lot of attention being placed. Really, it starts with that finished goods inventory, understanding that demand variability and the value, and then pulling that demand thread through the entire organization, really optimizing the system parameters so that you understand the reorder points, given some of the lead time variability and so on and so forth. So staying on top of those planning parameters and ensuring that you have the data to be able to make informed trade-off decisions is really important. Developing and implementing a plan for every part. It's a oldie but goodie when it comes to lean manufacturing and really collecting all of the key relevant data around each of your parts. And this is important, and I reference it because we've seen a lot of companies with very incomplete or dirty data, and it just really compounds the challenge of trying to make trade-off decisions. How are you going to allocate your scarce resources, to be able to produce your high value finished goods? Where can you make the most margin given the production plan that you have and the mix that you have? Without having some of that data at a part level, it's really tough to make some of those trade-off decisions. So we're seeing a lot of folks trying to work on the hygiene of their data and their systems to ensure that they can make more informed trade-off decisions moving forward. I heard this term at a conference last week by one of the automotive OEM supply chain executives, and I hadn't heard it before. Supply chain failure mode effects analysis. I'm very familiar with design failure mode effectiveness, and process failure mode effects analysis. What I haven't really thought about is more of a comprehensive view. Makes all the sense in the world, but that's what a lot of clients are really trying to do, is understand where those areas of risk are. We've ended up in this situation because as Jason was mentioning earlier, our supply chains have evolved over the past several decades to become extremely efficient, globally sourced supply chains, but that's resulted in extremely brittle supply chains. Back in the 80s, we had excess inventory throughout the value chain, and it was much easier to react to this. Obviously, there was a lot of waste in the system, but the pendulum has swung, and we are focused on trying to understand the areas of risk. And that leads to strategic sourcing. I thought, frankly, this was more of a talking point than a reality. There's a lot of savings to be gained from globally sourcing, and I think a lot of folks have been very focused on that efficiency. And so we weren't sure at RSM how extensive companies were going to be looking at the opportunity to source, perhaps taking a more geographic or regional strategy rather than a global strategy to sourcing. I was encouraged to hear that some of the purchasing executives that were at the same conference that I referred to were actually starting to look at that. So do I think it's going to be, wholesale coming back to the US? Unlikely. I do expect folks looking at more regional suppliers or regional sourcing strategies, I should say, to better meet those customer expectations. Again, it's really about ensuring your company's ability to maintain those customer service levels, to exceed those customer expectations, and how you can do it, balancing that risk and resiliency with the efficiency and margins that you're looking for. Improving the supplier contracts. There's a lot of folks that have been unprepared. Talked to a lawyer recently, and he's spending a vast majority of his time on supply chain litigation and really helping his clients to renegotiate contracts with OEMs, or OEMs trying to renegotiate contracts, and so on and so forth. So what the outcome of this is, I think we're learning a ton that could be considered in your future contracting process. What do you do about raw material pricing increases? How do you handle that? How can you, address work stoppages? Is there an opportunity to get your tooling and move it to another location? There's a myriad of things that you could contemplate. It's unlikely that we're going to be able to capture them all in the contracts, but I think this is the time as we move through this difficult period to really capture those lessons learned and think how we can deal with our suppliers, partner with our suppliers more effectively, and contractually protect one another in these situations of disruption. Jason talked a lot about the improving the supply chain visibility and resiliency. In my mind, they go hand in hand. We've spent a fair amount of time talking about, over the past several years, supplier risk management, which was very laser focused on ensuring production parts are coming to the assembly plants and they're available and on time. A lot of folks looked at on-time delivery, quality, the financial health of their suppliers, the capacity of their suppliers, and then of course those geopolitical / anonymous events like weather or socio-political issues and so on and so forth. That's pretty straightforward when it comes to your tier 1 suppliers. In fact, I've worked with some very mature companies that have good predictive tools in place to help anticipate delivery issues or quality issues. We're moving into a whole new world order though, and it's not likely your tier 1 that's going to take you down, but it might be a tier 3 or a tier 4 that's supplying multiple tier 2s and could have the potential to stop work at a tier 1. Right? So that's where the visibility comes into play. This is not an easy problem to solve. A lot of people are very focused on it. We think of it as N-tier visibility. So going down to, your suppliers, whatever the appropriate level of detail is. But as we think about risk, that's where the risk really resides. It's going to be a small 12-cent chip that might stop the shipment of hundreds of thousands of F-150s, for example. That's real, right? So trying to understand where all of your suppliers are and having the means to really assess the impact of a disruption at their site on the rest of your supply chain is where the conversation is going. It's a lot of conversation around this happening in automotive, where there's a very hierarchical tier structure. It's also being heavily focused on in aerospace and defense. In fact, there's a lot of regulations that are coming into play around that visibility, ensuring that they don't have adversarial suppliers at lower levels of the value chain. So this is an area that is a lot of progress is being made. There's a lot of technology solutions, but cracking the nut on that tier N visibility remains a challenge to be completely solved. So I think we're going to see a lot more conversation on resiliency in the years to come. It's also expanding in a couple different dimensions, not only looking at your production suppliers, but other third parties that work with companies, moving into more third-party risk management, as well as other areas of risk that are being comprehended. So I mentioned 5 before that relate to typical production parts, but when you expand the circle to include other third parties, including your production suppliers, you're going to want to look at things like cybersecurity or reputational risk, things like that. So this is an ongoing area that's I think will remain in the spotlight for some time. And then Jason also mentioned the ESG. So as we think of the ESG, a lot of the efforts have been by a company trying to focus on how they treat their employees, how they operate in their community, what they do to be a good corporate citizen. The efforts are now expanding to include not only their actions, but the actions of others that they're related to. Suppliers being a great example, right? What are their labor laws like that they're adhering to? Are there conflict minerals that need to be dealt with? And so I think we're going to see, these areas of resiliency and ESG kind of coalescing around this need for supply chain visibility. A lot more to come in that space. I'm really excited about some of the developments that I've seen so far. Improving S&OP processes. What I mean by that is really the integrated planning process that a company uses to better align supply with demand. It's known as sales and operations planning in this case, integrated business planning. There's a lot of names for it, but at the end of the day, it's really about having a cross-functional process to better align supply with demand. And so it starts with trying to get a better sense of demand. That's not easy today. The historical models aren't always proving to be all that accurate. We're seeing a lot of discussion around migrating to more econometric models where other variables are taken into account, like fuel prices in a given market, unemployment in a given market, so on and so forth, trying to get a far more accurate view of that demand. But then really having that cross-functional team in place and that governance process in place to think through how best to meet that demand, to make those trade-off decisions, and really to get the organization aligned around one consensus-driven demand plan, and everybody's pulling their oars in the same direction towards meeting that demand. And then those planning process lead to hopefully having that data from improved plan for every part, along with the planning process. Really now we have the data and the processes to really help make more informed trade-off decisions. Allocation is the name of the game today. You know, how can you use what you have to maximize the expectations of your stakeholders and achieve the financial targets that you have. From an ambitious standpoint, we are hearing some clients talk about moving production closer to demand. Have not heard about wholesale getting out of Asia or anything like that. It's more of a diversification strategy, exploring what the alternatives might be, exploring what a better distribution network might look like. We've done some work with clients to analyze these moves. In some situations, the time and effort it would take to implement these changes really was much longer than the anticipated disruptions would last. And so we haven't seen as much movement in the ambitious area as we have in more of the prudent area. So these are a lot of the things that we're seeing companies do to address a lot of the supply chain disruptions, and we'd be happy to entertain any questions that the audience might have.
All right, thank you, Jason and Bart. There's a lot that you unpacked there, and a lot of information that's near and dear to all of us. And if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll facilitate that. All right. Doesn't look like we have any questions here. I don't see any questions in there. So if nobody has any questions, we'll continue to move on there. Again, Jason and Bart, thank you so much for sharing with us today. It was definitely I enjoyed it. I know I'm sure everyone else did as well.
Thank you for having us.
All right. Thanks again to our sponsors. Harding and Szymanski is our events sponsor, as well as Toyota is our signature sponsor, and our other sponsors as well: Anchor, Berry, Cook, Jasper Engines, and Old National Bank. If you're not following us on social media, please do so. Bouncing around here on the slides, but you can find us, Tri-State Manufacturing Alliance, on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Again, if you're not involved in the peer groups, I encourage you to get involved. There's a lot of great resources there for all you guys. Again, thanks for coming out today. The Q4 event or Q1 event in January, make sure that you sign up for that early, and we thank you for coming out today. See you guys.